took the job at the Crescent Moon Hotel because I didn't have much of a choice. Bills were piling up, and I needed something, anything, that paid regularly. The ad had been vague. Night clerk needed, quiet environment, housing provided. It didn't mention the isolation or the sense of unease that would come with it, but I figured that out the moment I arrived. The Crescent Moon wasn't what I'd expected. Perched on the edge of town, far enough that it felt like the middle of nowhere, the building loomed against the sky like an old, forgotten relic. Its peeling paint and weathered wooden facade gave it the look of a place that should have been condemned years ago. But there were lights on in the lobby, warm and inviting, and the faint glow of a vacancy sign buzzed faintly in the window. The vacancy alarm sounded faintly in the window. I stepped inside and the air hit me. A strange mix of mildew, old wood, and something faintly metallic. It wasn't overpowering, but it clung to the back of my throat. The lobby was quaint in a way that felt off. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, and a dusty chandelier hung precariously above a worn check-in desk. Behind it was a wall of keys, each dangling from an old brass hook. The numbers on the tags were tarnished, barely legible. Mr. Hutchins, the manager, was already waiting for me when I walked in. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with deep-set eyes that seemed too large for his face. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Right on time," he said, his voice raspy, like he'd been smoking a pack a day for the last 40 years. "This is a quiet job. Suits someone who doesn't mind keeping to themselves." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Let's get to it then," he said, motioning me behind the desk. "This is where you'll spend most of your time. Phones rarely ring, and guests don't usually need much after dark. But there are rules." "Rules?" I asked, my brow furrowing. He handed me a small laminated card. The edges were worn, and the writing was simple, printed in block letters. The rules were short, but the phrasing made my skin crawl. Never leave the desk between midnight and 6 a.m. If a guest asks for room 13, tell them it's unavailable. Do not elaborate. If you hear a knock on the front door after 2 a.m., do not open it. If the phone rings, but there's no name on the guest ledger, let it ring. Keep the guest ledger open at all times. If the pages move, do not touch them. I stared at the card, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me it was some kind of initiation joke. But he didn't. His expression was grim, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Follow the rules, and you'll be fine," he said. "The guests here, they're not like the ones you're used to." I wanted to ask what he meant, but something about his tone stopped me. He handed me a worn, leather-bound book and a pen. "This is the guest ledger," he said. "Anyone who checks in, you write their name here. Always. No exceptions." I nodded, feeling the weight of the book in my hands. It was heavier than it looked, the leather cracked and dry, like it had been sitting there for decades. Before I could ask any more questions, he clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You'll do fine," he said. "Just stick to the rules." With that, he left, his footsteps fading as he disappeared down a narrow hallway. The silence that followed was deafening. I settled behind the desk, trying to make sense of the rules. They were too specific, too strange. What kind of place needed instructions like this? I flipped through the guest ledger, the pages filled with names written in elegant cursive, the dates beside them stretched back decades, but the most recent entry was blank. I set the book down, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had settled over me. The first hour passed quietly. The lobby was still, the only sounds the faint hum of the chandelier and the occasional creak of the building settling. I was beginning to think the rules were just quirks of an eccentric old man. Then the phone rang. I jumped, the sharp sound cutting through the silence like a knife. My eyes darted to the guest ledger, and my stomach dropped. The page was blank. No names, no entries, just empty lines staring back at me. The silence added to the pressure as I moved forward in the slide. The phone kept ringing, louder and more insistent with each tone. I stared at it, my hand hovering over the receiver. The card's rules burned in my mind. If the phone rings but there's no name on the guest ledger, let it ring. I pulled my hand back, heart pounding, and watched as the phone rang and rang and rang. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick and oppressive. Somewhere in the building, a floorboard creaked. The silence after the phone stopped ringing was worse than the sound itself. It hung in the air, heavy and unnatural, pressing against my chest like I'd been holding my breath for too long. I glanced at the guest ledger again, as if somehow a name might have appeared in the blank space while I wasn't looking. But the page was still empty, just rows of clean, pale lines staring back at me like an accusation. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself of Mr. Hutchins's words, "Follow the rules and you'll be fine." Maybe the phone was old, faulty. The whole place felt like it had been stuck in the 1950s, so a malfunction wouldn't have been surprising. But something about the way it rang. It didn't feel like a malfunction. I busied myself tidying the desk, trying to push the thought out of my mind. The drawer beneath the counter was filled with oddities, faded receipts, mismatched pens, a stack of old postcards featuring a long-faded photo of the Crescent Moon Hotel. One of the cards caught my eye. It wasn't like the others. Its edges were singed and the picture on the front was barely visible, the colors distorted like it had been left too close to a fire. Flipping it over, I noticed faint writing. The ink smudged, but still readable. "Don't let them in. You can't save them." My stomach twisted, and I shoved the card back into the drawer. It was probably some old prank or a leftover scribble from a bored guest. At least, that's what I told myself. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from somewhere behind me. It froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a clear voice, more like the sound of air moving through a narrow space, carrying fragments of words I couldn't quite understand. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The lobby was empty. The hallway leading to the guest rooms was shrouded in shadows, the flickering light bulb at its far end casting long, jittery shapes on the walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The sound felt too loud, out of place in the suffocating stillness. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stepped out from behind the desk, my shoes scuffing against the worn carpet as I approached the hallway. The air felt colder here, heavier, like stepping into a different room entirely. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple, their edges blurring as if they were alive. I shined the flashlight down the hall, but it only illuminated the first few doors. Beyond that, the darkness seemed impenetrable. That's when I noticed the door to room 13. It was open just a crack. My chest tightened. Mr. Hutchins had been clear. If someone asks for room 13, tell them it's unavailable. No one had asked for it, but there it was, the faint sliver of an open door taunting me from the end of the hall. Against every instinct, I stepped closer. The flashlight beam wavered, the bulb flickering as I reached the door. My hand hesitated on the knob, the cold metal sending a shiver up my arm. I pushed it open slowly, the creak echoing down the empty hallway. The room was empty. At least, it looked empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tightly shut. But there was something wrong with the air. It smelled faintly of smoke, like a fire had been put out recently. The walls were bare except for a single frame above the headboard. The photo inside was old, faded to near grayscale, but I could make out the outline of a man standing in front of the hotel. His face was blurred as if someone had smudged it with their thumb. Beneath the frame, carved directly into the wall, were the words, "He's still here." Chill ran down my spine. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and something shifted in the corner of the room. My beam landed on a closet door, its surface scratched and battered, as if something had clawed at it. The whispers started again, louder this time, like a dozen voices speaking at once, overlapping and chaotic. I didn't stay to find out what was inside. I slammed the door shut and bolted back to the lobby, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I barely made it to the desk before the guest ledger snapped shut on its own. The sound was sharp, almost deliberate, and when I opened it again, there was a new name written in shaky, uneven handwriting. Nathaniel Halloway. I didn't recognize the name, but it felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. I flipped back through the previous pages, scanning the list of guests. There it was, written again and again on almost every page, Nathaniel Halloway. Sometimes the date next to it was crossed out, rewritten in a different hand. Sometimes it was the only name on the page. The phone rang again, sharp and shrill, cutting through the silence. My breath caught as I stared at it, my hand hovering over the receiver. The name in the ledger burned in my mind. I didn't answer, letting it ring until the sound cut off abruptly. The quiet that followed wasn't comforting. It felt alive, pressing against me like it was waiting for something. I picked up the laminated rule sheet, reading it over again for the 100th time. The rules didn't make sense, but breaking them clearly had consequences. I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to see the shadows spilling out into the lobby, but it was empty. For now. A faint knock echoed through the lobby, coming from the front door. My heart sank. It was barely 3 a.m. The knock came again, louder this time. I looked at the rule sheet one last time, my eyes locking on the third rule. If you hear a knock on the front door after 2 a.m., do not open it. The knock came again, harder this time, echoing through the empty lobby. My hand tightened around the edge of the desk as I stared at the front door. The frosted glass rattled in its frame with each knock, but I couldn't see who or what was on the other side. The laminated rule sheet burned in my mind. If you hear a knock on the front door after 2 a.m., do not open it. I swallowed hard, backing away from the desk. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I thought that might be the end of it, but then I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth across the porch. The boards creaked under the weight of something heavy, and the sound sent chills crawling up my spine. The footsteps stopped, and a new noise replaced them. A low, muffled voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like whoever was outside was whispering directly into the door. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, stepping closer to the desk. The flashlight in my hand trembled as I raised it toward the frosted glass. A shadow moved behind the glass. It wasn't the shape of a person. It was tall, too tall, its outline jagged and shifting like smoke. My stomach twisted as the whispering grew louder, overlapping and distorted, as if several voices were speaking all at once. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest, and I stumbled back, gripping the desk for support. Then the shadow pressed against the glass. The frosted pane bulged inward, the wood around it groaning under the pressure. My heart pounded as I scrambled to grab the guest ledger. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, hoping, praying that a name had appeared. The pages were blank, but they didn't stay that way for long. The ink bled across the paper, forming jagged letters. Do not let it in. I dropped the book, and the moment it hit the desk, the shadow retreated. The whispers stopped, and the room felt eerily silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. Yes, then the phone rang. The sharp trill made me jump, and my eyes darted toward the desk. The name on the guest ledger was gone, the pages clean and blank once again. My chest tightened as I reached for the receiver, my hand hovering over it. Rule number 4 echoed in my mind. If the phone rings, but there's no name on the guest ledger, let it ring. But I couldn't. I had to know. I snatched the receiver and pressed it to my ear. Hello? My voice cracked barely above a whisper. Static crackled on the other end, faint at first, but growing louder. Then came the voice, low and distorted. You broke the rules. What do you mean? I stammered, my grip tightening on the phone. The static surged, drowning out the voice for a moment, but I caught the last words clearly. It's inside. The line went dead. I dropped the phone and turned toward the lobby. The room was empty, but something felt wrong. The air was colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room, the beam jittery and weak. That's when I heard it. A faint, scuffling sound coming from the hallway. My pulse thundered as I stepped out from behind the desk, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The hallway stretched before me, the flickering light bulb casting long, uneven shadows. The sound grew louder, closer, and I realized it wasn't just scuffling. It was footsteps. The shadows on the walls moved, but not in sync with the light. They twisted and stretched, forming shapes that didn't belong to any person. My breathing quickened as I took a step back, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" My voice echoed down the hall, shaky and unsure. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the end of the hall, a door creaked open. It was room 13. My stomach turned as I stared at the open doorway. The light inside the room was faint, flickering like a dying candle, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The air grew colder with each step I took, my legs moving on their own, as if something was pulling me forward. When I reached the doorway, I hesitated. The room felt wrong, like it was waiting for me. The faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, and the shadows on the walls seemed to ripple like water. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside. The bed was empty, the covers neatly folded as if no one had touched them, but the mirror above the dresser caught my attention. It was cracked, the fractures spider-webbing across its surface. My reflection stared back at me, but something about it was off. The shadows in the room didn't match the ones in the mirror. They moved independently, twisting and writhing like living things. Then, in the corner of the reflection, I saw it, a figure standing just behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, but there was nothing there. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was closer now, its outline blurred and shifting like smoke. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The room plunged into darkness. The flashlight slipped from my hand as the air around me thickened, pressing against my chest like a vice. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, filling the room with an unbearable noise. I stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the mirror, and in it, the figure was no longer pointing. It was smiling. The darkness in room 13 was absolute, swallowing everything. The air felt suffocating, heavy with the scent of smoke and something metallic, like rusted iron. My breathing was shallow, each inhale burning my lungs. I fumbled for the flashlight, my fingers scraping against the cold, uneven floor. When I finally found it, the beam flickered weakly, barely cutting through the blackness. Something moved in the corner. It wasn't the same faint ripple of shadows I'd seen earlier. This was deliberate, heavy, like a presence pressing against the edges of reality. My hands trembled as I pointed the flashlight toward the corner, the beam landing on a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long and bent at odd angles. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth, pale void, featureless and horrifying. The whispers started again, louder this time, overlapping and disjointed. They weren't coming from the figure but from all around me, as if the walls themselves were speaking. My pulse thundered as the figure tilted its head, its faceless void staring directly at me. I choked out, my voice barely audible over the whispers. "What do you want?" The figure took a step forward, its movements unnervingly fluid. The whispers surged, and the shadows in the room began to twist and writhe like living things. They crept along the walls and floor, reaching toward me with inky tendrils. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure raised a hand, long and spindly, and pointed at the mirror. I glanced toward it, the cracked surface reflecting the room in distorted fragments. But the reflection wasn't right. In the mirror, the figure wasn't pointing at the glass. It was pointing at me. The shadows surged, wrapping around my ankles like cold, wet ropes. I screamed, thrashing and kicking as they tightened their grip. The flashlight fell from my hand, spinning across the floor and casting frantic, stuttering beams of light across the room. The figure moved closer, its head tilting again, almost curiously. Desperation took over. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal lamp from the bedside table, and swung it at the figure. The lamp passed through it like smoke, and the momentum sent me stumbling backward. My shoulder hit the wall, and for a moment, I felt something behind me, a pulse, rhythmic and alive, coming from the wall itself. I spun around, pressing my hand against the cracked wallpaper. The pulse grew stronger, and the whispers shifted, forming words I could almost understand. The door. You opened the door. The figure was inches away now, its hand outstretched toward me. The shadows wrapped tighter, climbing up my legs and pulling me toward the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and terrified, but it wasn't just me anymore. The figure was in the reflection too, standing behind me, its hand resting on my shoulder. "No," I gasped, clawing at the wall. "This isn't real." But it was. The shadows pulled harder, and my reflection smiled, a cold, hollow grin that wasn't my own. The figure in the mirror moved closer, its faceless head merging with my own reflection. I could feel it, a weight pressing into me, suffocating and freezing all at once. The whispers rose to a deafening roar as the mirror shattered, shards of glass raining down around me. The shadows recoiled, and for a moment I thought I was free. But the room was different now. The walls were bare, the bed gone, and the air was thick with a dense fog that clung to my skin. The figure was still there, standing in the center of the room, but it wasn't alone. Dozens of figures surrounded it, their bodies twisted and broken, their faces pale and hollow. They moved in unison, their footsteps echoing in perfect rhythm. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted for the door. It wouldn't budge. My hands fumbled with the knob, my nails digging into the wood as I pulled and pushed, but it was like the door was part of the wall. A voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. "You broke the rules." I spun around, my back pressed against the door. The figure stood inches away, its faceless void staring into me. Its voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through the air like a storm. "You opened the door," it said, each word slow and deliberate. "Now it cannot be closed." The room began to collapse. The walls folded inward, the ceiling spiraling into darkness. The floor beneath me crumbled, and I felt myself falling, the figures reaching for me as I plummeted into the void. Their hands brushed against my skin, cold and clammy, pulling and tearing as the darkness consumed me. Then, everything stopped. I was back at the front desk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their familiar, sickly glow. The guest ledger lay open on the desk, its pages blank except for one new entry: my name. Beneath it, written in jagged, uneven letters, was a single sentence: "You are the keeper now." I stared at the words, my chest heaving as the truth settled over me. The rule sheet was still taped to the desk, but the rules were different now. Do not leave the desk, no matter what you hear. Answer the phone, but never ask who's calling. If someone asks for room 13, check them in immediately. Keep the guest ledger open. Their names must be recorded. The phone rang. My hand moved on its own, reaching for the receiver. I tried to resist, but it was like my body wasn't mine anymore. I pressed the phone to my ear, and the voice on the other end was familiar. "Welcome," it said, low and distorted. "It's your turn." The phone clicked back into place, the sound sharp and final in the suffocating silence of the lobby. My hand lingered on the receiver, trembling as a wave of cold dread washed over me. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, their yellow glow unchanged, but everything felt off. The air was heavy, thick with the faint metallic tang of blood, though there was none to be seen. The world outside the front window was gone, just an expanse of dark, swirling mist pressing against the glass. I turned to the guest ledger, its pages still open to the entry with my name. But something had changed. Below my name, new entries began to appear, one after another, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. Isaac Crane, checked in, 12:13 a.m. Checked out, 2:37 a.m. Eliza Thorne, checked in, 1:05 a.m. Checked out, 3:22 a.m. Nathan Holloway, checked in, checked out. Never. The last entry wasn't written in ink. It looked burned into the page, the edges of the letters singed and curling. My throat tightened as I stared at it, the word never searing itself into my mind. My eyes darted to the rule sheet on the desk. It was the same as before, yet different. The last rule was new. The clerk may never leave. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the chair behind me. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of nightmare, a trick of my panicked mind. I turned toward the mirror on the wall, hoping to see something, anything, that would ground me in reality. But the reflection wasn't mine. It was the figure from room 13. Its featureless head stared back at me, tilting slightly as if mocking my fear. My chest tightened, and I reached up to touch my face, desperate to confirm I was still me. My fingers brushed against smooth, cold skin. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank canvas where my face used to be. "No," I whispered, stumbling away from the mirror. "This isn't real." But the reflection moved with me, its head tilting further, almost amused. Behind it, in the mirror's distorted surface, I saw the lobby change. The walls darkened, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal jagged cracks. Shadows spilled from the corners, pooling on the floor like ink. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their hollow eyes glowing faintly as they stepped closer. I turned away from the mirror, but the figures were in the room now. They surrounded me, their bodies twisted and broken, their movements unnatural. Each of them wore a name tag, the words etched into their pale skin. Isaac Crane, Eliza Thorne, Nathaniel Halloway. Their hollow eyes locked onto me, and I realized the truth. They were the clerks before me. The shadows pressed closer, the figures reaching out with skeletal hands. I backed into the desk, my fingers gripping the edge as if it might anchor me to something solid. But there was no escape. The front door was gone, replaced by a wall of swirling mist. The phone rang again, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. My body moved on its own, my hand reaching for the receiver. When I lifted it to my ear, the voice on the other end was my own. The receiver slipped from my hand, the sound of the dial tone droning faintly as the figures closed in. Their hands gripped my arms, my shoulders, pulling me toward the guest ledger. The pages flipped on their own, stopping at a blank one. The pen lifted from its holder, hovering in the air as though guided by an invisible hand.